In October 1917, German and Austro-Hungarian troops went over the top, into the rain and fog, to attack the Italian trenches opposite them. They would go on to break the trench deadlock on the Italian front and nearly destroy the Italian army in just 2 weeks. The Battle of Caporetto was Austria-Hungary's greatest victory of World War I, and where a young Erwin Rommel learned to fight like a desert fox. In fall 1917, the Central Powers knew that time was running out for their chance at victory in the First World War. The United States had joined the Allies, and soon there would be no chance of success on the Western Front. The German and Austro-Hungarian populations were hungry and exhausted, and the alliance between Berlin and Vienna was tense, since Habsburg Emperor Karl flirted with a separate peace. But there was hope. Russia was seized by revolution, and the new Bolshevik powers wanted to end the war in the East. The only external threat to Austria-Hungary was now Italy, whose army had been weakened by 11 mostly fruitless attacks along the Isonzo River since 1915. If the Central Powers could relieve the pressure on the Italian front, Austria-Hungary could fight on and help Germany's planned last-ditch offensive in spring 1918. The Austro-Hungarians were planning an offensive against Italy, and they wanted to do it on their own, mostly. Kaiser Karl I wrote Kaiser Wilhelm II asking his ally to take over more of the line in Russia to free up Habsburg units and to loan Vienna heavy guns. You will certainly understand that I particularly wish to conduct the offensive against Italy with only my own troops. My entire army considers the war against Italy our war. Since childhood, every officer has inherited from his forefathers the desire to fight against the hereditary enemy. But Berlin had other ideas. At this point in the war, the Germans didn't fully trust the Austrians, since Vienna openly wanted peace without annexations, which the German High Command opposed. German leadership considered the Austro-Hungarian army as too weak to attack on its own, and even thought the country would collapse if the alliance drifted further apart. A joint victory under German command would nip Vienna's doves in the bud and keep them in the war. At the same time, the capture of Riga on the Eastern Front in September freed up German troops for use elsewhere. So the Germans created the 14th Army to send to the Italian front, a mixed formation of German and Habsburg troops under the command of German General Otto von Below. The new army included the Württemberg Mountain Battalion and a young lieutenant by the name of Erwin Rommel. The 25-year-old Rommel was already experienced and decorated for his actions on the Western and Romanian fronts, but he and many other Central Powers soldiers were about to witness a battle unlike any that they had fought before. The plan for Operation Waffentreue, or Brotherhood in Arms, was for the German and best Austro-Hungarian units to infiltrate the Italian line on a 40-kilometer front near the key village of Kobarid, called Karfreid in German and Caporetto in Italian. Then they would seize the high ground and race along the valleys until they reached the Tagliamento River. An Austrian officer described the plan as a fist punching through a barrier, then unclenching to spread its fingers, a stormtrooper tactic the Germans had success with at Riga in September. If things went well, the German command would decide what to do after that. The idea was not necessarily to knock Italy out of the war completely, but simply to cripple it. The Central Powers had about 350,000 men and 2,500 guns ready for the attack, facing about 250,000 Italians and their 1,300 guns. Still, it wouldn't be easy. Logistic routes ran over narrow mountain roads, there wasn't enough locomotives and railway cars for supplies, and their troops were already short of food, cigarettes, and even salt. The weakened Austro-Hungarians had also narrowly avoided defeat at the 11th Battle of the Isonzo in September. And those Italians were not ready. Morale had suffered due to repeated attacks with no breakthrough over the previous 2 years, and the excessive discipline of overall commander General Luigi Cadorna. Italian positions were vulnerable with their backs to the Isonzo River, and the High Command failed to ensure proper defensive measures had been taken, partly because Cadorna was distracted by political intrigues in Rome. The British cabinet was not impressed with its ally. The Austrians are suffering more from the lack of food and drink than from Italian fire. On the eve of battle, 2 Austro-Hungarian officers, 1 Romanian and 1 Czech, deserted and alerted the Italians to the danger. German General Konrad Kraft von Dellmensingen was livid. With such a Völkerbrei, which contains such oppositional and inferior elements, one can no longer undertake something in common. These are the fruits of Kaiser Karl's amnesty of traitors. We will send our army command a serious report of how things stand with this country. Despite the defections, which the Italians ignored, the Central Powers launched their offensive in the early morning fog on October 24, 1917. German and Austro-Hungarian guns delivered a short but intense 4-hour bombardment, including massive amounts of poison gas. The shelling and mix of different gases, called Buntschießen because of the different color codes for the gases, caught the Italians by surprise. Irritating gases forced the men to remove their masks, and then they inhaled deadlier chemicals. Central Powers infantrymen went over the top and quickly found weak spots in the Italian defenses to exploit. Among them was Erwin Rommel, who noted the success of German and Austro-Hungarian counter-battery fire. It was a dark and rainy night, and in no time, 1,000 gun muzzles were flashing on both sides of Tolmain. In the enemy territory, an uninterrupted bursting and banging thundered and re-echoed from the mountains as powerfully as the severest thunderstorm. The Italian searchlights tried vainly to pierce the rain, and only a few hostile batteries answered the German fire. The Central Powers' success was more complete than even they had hoped. Their forces burst out of the Tolmain bridgehead and around Jaga, capturing or bypassing the most important Italian positions. Confusion reigned in Italian lines as whole units found themselves outflanked, surrounded, or suddenly overlooked by enemy forces they hadn't expected. Tens of thousands surrendered. Italian Lieutenant Carlo Gadda's unit was among them, and he could barely stand the shame on the long walk to an Austrian prisoner camp. Marching from midnight to 8 a.m., horror, extremely sleepy and exhausted. The end of hope, annihilation of interior life. Extreme anguish for the fatherland. Other Italian soldiers felt relief that the war might be ending and that they might get out of it alive. Units who could retreated pell-mell, and some officers even abandoned their men. Positions that had been conquered at the expense of hundreds of thousands of Italian lives were given up without a fight as rivers of disorganized men streamed westwards, although some Italian troops did resist. At first, Italian High Command had no idea of the scale of the disaster. Cadorna only learned of the attack late in the morning, and news arrived piecemeal. Second Army Commander Luigi Capello ordered his reserves forward, but the confusion and panic prevented any effective command and control. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Rommel was leading his men to the capture of important high ground near the Italian stronghold of Colburn. His unit bypassed enemy positions on the lower slopes, moved uphill, then snuck up on the unsuspecting Italians below. We went downhill through the bushes with our machine guns and carbines at the ready, and we soon saw the hostile position below us. From above, we looked down on the bottom of the trench. The enemy had no cover against our fire. The enemy did not suspect what threatened him. The assault squads made ready, and we shouted down to the hostile garrison and told them to surrender. Frightened, the Italian soldiers stared up to us at their rear. They knew they were lost and gave the sign of surrender. Many Central Powers units achieved similar successes, and Italian resistance crumbled. On the afternoon of the first day, they blow some of the bridges over the Isonzo, but quick-moving German and Austro-Hungarian troops capture others intact and soon capture Caporetto. Some residents of the Austro-Hungarian town lined the streets and greeted the troops with shouts of "Živio Austria!" Long live Austria! By evening, Cadorna ordered the 2nd and 3rd armies to retreat to the Tagliamento, but it was too late. The Italian Second Army was broken and in full, uncontrolled retreat. Cadorna blamed his own men. Due to the lack of resistance of some units of the Second Army, who cowardly retreated without fighting or ignominiously surrendered to the enemy, the German-Austrian forces have been allowed to break through our left flank on the Julian front. The valorous efforts of other troops were not able to stop the enemy from penetrating our country's sacred soil. So by the end of the first day of the Battle of Caporetto, the Italian army was already facing disaster. The question was, how bad would it get? In the days and weeks that followed, the Central Powers continued to slice through the Italians. Rommel even disobeyed orders for a tactical retreat to press on against another Italian position, which his unit captured. Austro-Hungarian General Sviatozar Borojevich's army joined into the advance, forcing the Italian Third Army to accelerate its retreat to avoid being cut off. The Italian Second Army was a shadow of its former self, consisting mostly of columns of men retreating as fast as they could, fleeing groups of deserters, or long lines of prisoners marching to the east. Rommel's small unit alone captured 2 entire regiments of the Salerno Brigade, whom they convinced to surrender. Austrian officer Julius Kugi witnessed the mass of prisoners moving back from the line. The whole time, crowds of prisoners moved past us towards Golobar. We saw wounded among them, and there were many tragic and heart-rending images. Transports continued to pass, even throughout the night. They were all hungry and exhausted, but since we ourselves had nothing to eat, we couldn't help them. Back on the battlefield, by October 29th, Austro-Hungarian troops were closing on the Tagliamento River. The panicked Italians blew up the Eiffel Bridge, trapping 2 entire divisions on the eastern bank and condemning most of them to captivity. Draconian orders allowed officers to execute stragglers at will, scenes that Red Cross ambulance driver Ernest Hemingway would later work into his novel A Farewell to Arms. The Italian rout continued across the river, but former Austro-Hungarian overall commander Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf's army made slow progress in the north. Some German generals expected Conrad might be able to Sedanize the Italians and cut them off from the rear, but these hopes went unrealized. German commanders decided to press on farther than originally planned, and the other Central Powers armies continued their race across northern Italy, crossing the Livenza River on November 6th. The advance and news of victory brought joy to an exhausted Austro-Hungarian public. Newspapers wrote of the Wunder von Karfreitz, the miracle of Caporetto, and the government launched a war bonds campaign with the enthusiastic support of the Catholic Church. In the last few days, our glorious armies have begun a splendid offensive against the hereditary enemy and have not only wrung from him the fruits of his 11 Isonzo battles, but have driven him deep within his own country. Obviously, heaven is with us. God himself has put us in the right mood for the 7th war bond. Kaiser Karl, Kaiser Wilhelm, and Bulgaria's Tsar Ferdinand all visited the liberated and occupied areas as well. But their forces were also suffering from exhaustion, hunger, and shortages of supplies. As a result, once they crossed the border into Italy, they began looting and destroying the property of some Italian civilians. Austrian officer Ludwig Hessheimer witnessed the desperation. Emaciated Austrian soldiers in torn, filth-soaked uniforms, without underclothes, stared vacantly out of bloodshot eyes ahead. So they hurried and gasped forwards for days, without rest, without sleep, without food, just forwards, forwards. The 2 Central Powers' distrust also caused other problems. Borojevich held up some German units under his command so his own forces could destroy the Italian Third Army, but they failed to do so. There were also reports that Austrian intelligence officers put German units under surveillance to make sure they wouldn't mistreat the liberated Austro-Hungarian population. On the Italian side, Cadorna's initial hopes of a fighting retreat proved to be fantasy, and he even briefly considered the idea of a separate peace. He also wrote his son that the men didn't want to fight and that he himself had a clear conscience. Rome was not so calm in the face of disaster and the possible loss of Venice. In Parliament, socialists and anti-war liberals brought down the government, and Cadorna opponent Vittorio Orlando became the new prime minister. Orlando's government also asked Britain and France for help to stem the tide. London and Paris were worried that Italy might drop out of the war or collapse in revolution like Russia had a few months earlier. They quickly sent several divisions and eventually deployed 200,000 men on the Italian front. But there were tensions. British General Douglas Haig said the Italians were a wretched people, and a British General Staff report was less than generous. Italy is an additional burden on us, and moreover, Italy is similarly unreliable to France. One topic the 3 allies did agree on was that Cadorna had to go. General Armando Diaz took over command and relaxed the needlessly harsh discipline that had undermined morale. So Italy was buckling under the pressure, but the Central Powers' advance was also slowing down. The Italians managed to reposition their forces and bring up reinforcements in time to make a stand along the Piave River in mid-November. before the French and British units arrived in the line. Engineers blew the bridges, and overstretched Austro-Hungarian forces could not push the Italians off the heights around Monte Grappa to outflank the Italian line. The Italian army, including many young soldiers of the draft class of 1899, stood firm, and the battle was over. Austrian commanders complained that the Germans refused to help them, and the Germans complained that the Austrians were too slow. All the same, their forces had advanced about 150 kilometers in just 17 days, and removed any Italian threat to the Austro-Hungarian heartland. The Central Powers' victory at Caporetto, though, came at a cost. The Italians lost about 40,000 killed and wounded, 290,000 prisoners, and between 250 and 400,000 deserters and stragglers. Germany and Austria-Hungary lost 50 to 70,000 killed and wounded. They also captured valuable supplies, like nearly 1 million greatcoats, 10 million rations, coal, and 3,000 guns. The battle caused a wave of refugees as well, up to 1 million, including some 250,000 ethnic Italians who fled from recaptured Austro-Hungarian territory. There were so many that Rome had to create support programs to resettle them across the kingdom, although this did not prevent widespread suffering and sometimes unfriendly attitudes on the part of local Italians toward enemy citizens from Austro-Hungarian lands. Nearly all faced similar hardships to this woman. I was brought here to this town in Puglia. Here you cannot even find water to wash, and I have to pay a high price for it, meeting this expense from my small daily wage of 2 liri. With the huge increase in the price of food, I have to see to all my needs out of these 2 liri. I cannot even go out from my shelter to look for a decent job, since I'm ashamed to look so shabby and to be so badly dressed. Ironically, Austria-Hungary's greatest victory of the war proved to be a Pyrrhic one, as it brought it closer to collapse. With the crippling of Italy, the Central Powers had now defeated Serbia and Romania and forced Russia into revolution. Vienna's war was nearly won, but society was on the edge. The Caporetto offensive had required so many trains and use of railways that precious food, already in very short supply, could not reach the cities in the Austrian half of the empire. After the initial euphoria of victory, this worsened the hunger and discontent of an already war-weary population on the brink of collapse. Austrian bureaucrats had warned of this danger before the offensive began, but the military command took the risk. The shock of Caporetto caused the Allies to create a Supreme War Council to better coordinate their efforts. Despite an Italian investigative commission after the war, the defeat also contributed to Italian feelings of humiliation and recrimination that caused political turmoil for years after the armistice. These were made worse by Cadorna and other nationalists blaming the defeat on treachery from within. Caporetto was also a watershed moment for Erwin Rommel. He received Germany's highest honor, the Pour le Mérite, for his actions during the battle, and he was promoted to captain. After the war, Rommel drew on his experiences at Caporetto in his influential book Infantry Attacks, which emphasized speed, risk, and deception when on the offensive. He would apply these principles again alongside Italian allies just 20 years later. In World War II, after Rommel's campaigns in northern Africa, in 1944 he took over Army Group B in northern France, which was preparing for the Allied invasion. He argued unsuccessfully for the Germans to concentrate their tanks close to the beaches and organize the Normandy defenses. But he was soon badly wounded and implicated in the July plot against Hitler, and then he committed suicide. Meanwhile, Army Group B was eventually pushed back across the Rhine River and encircled in the Ruhr pocket. If you want to learn more about the last battles of the Second World War in the East and in the West, we made 2 epic documentaries about them. The first one is 16 Days in Berlin, the most detailed documentary about the Battle of Berlin ever produced. A 4.5-hour day-by-day breakdown of one of the biggest battles of the entire war when the Red Army advanced from the Oder River into the heart of Nazi Germany's capital. Filmed on original location, featuring detailed maps and animations, expert interviews, and much more. The second documentary is Rhineland 45, about the last set-piece battle on the Western Front in which the Allies under Bernard Montgomery attacked from the Dutch border and ultimately crossed the mighty Rhine River. This 3.5-hour documentary was also filmed on original location and features detailed maps and animations, expert and veteran interviews, and more. But you can't watch 16 Days in Berlin or Rhineland 45 on YouTube because of our uncompromising portrayal of the war using authentic combat footage. So where can you watch these two massive documentaries with a combined runtime of over 8 hours? On Nebula, a streaming service we're building together with other creators, where we don't have to worry about YouTube's advertising guidelines and the mighty algorithm. If you sign up at nebula.tv/The Great War, you can watch all our content in 4K, ad-free, and earlier than on YouTube, and all that for just $36 a year. And if you really want to support us and our production of long-form, highly detailed history documentaries, the Nebula Lifetime membership is available again for $300. You pay once and get Nebula for as long as both you and Nebula exist. The money of the Lifetime membership allows us to invest more time and resources into original series, and it supports us here at Real Time History directly. Again, that's nebula.tv/The Great War. We want to thank Annabelle Blakey for her help with this episode. If you want to learn more about Rommel in North Africa, check out our videos about his campaigns on our sister channel, Real Time History. As usual, you can find all the sources for this video in the description below. And if you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that is in the right mood for the next war bond.